Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to walk along a cold stone path, dampened by the mist that descends like a veil over the fields. Outside, you might hear the distant sound of a car or the muffled echo of a television on in a neighboring apartment. But here, now, time will slow down. We're going to immerse ourselves in a world where silence was as thick as bread that was broken with effort. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you can, write in the comments your city and the time you're listening to this story. I like to imagine where each of you rests your head as you travel with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft hum in the background, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Have you ever felt hungry? But not the hurried hunger of someone who forgot to eat lunch. I'm talking about the hunger that lingers, the one that has no time to arrive or leave, the hunger that haunts, not with stomach growls, but with the slowness of weak steps and sunken hunger as a state of mind, like a shadow that sits at the table, even when nothing is served. Tonight, we go back to a time when this presence was constant, like the cold, a time when each bite, no matter how thin, was an achievement, and each plate, no matter how empty, was shared with faith. There were days when the cloudy sky seemed to repeat the color of the soup, grey, thick, and without promise. Peasants walked with their eyes down, searching for something among the stones on the road, sometimes a forgotten root, sometimes just silence. They knew the art of fooling their stomachs, but they could never fool their bodies for long. Still, they survived, and in doing so, they created an invisible culture made of broths, bran, and small gestures. We are not here to study these foods as exotic curiosities, but to sit at the table with them, to breathe the same air, and perhaps to feel a little of what they felt when they ate almost nothing. The days began early, but there was no rush, because nothing was guaranteed. Not bread, not water, not hope. The smell of the morning was of damp smoke and beaten earth. The first spoonfuls of some barley porridge were chewed in silence. A child held the plate with both hands. Mother blew on it to cool the steam. Sometimes the food didn't even taste good, but it was warm, and that alone warmed the heart too, even if only for a short time. Eating was more than an act. It was almost a ritual of faith, a silent affirmation that one was there, one more day. And even when there was only water and a few wilted leaves in the pot, there was a way to make a moment of it. The sound of the boiling, the smell of the wood, the care taken in serving the same portion to everyone. Hunger, however cruel it was, also brought people together. It created bonds that comfort perhaps would not have created. In each spoonful of porridge, there were memories of other days, and in each silence, an unspoken pact. Let's endure it together. The food was little, but its symbolism was immense. It sustained not only the body, but the spirit. Tonight, we will follow this path, step by step, dish by dish. We will see what those who had nothing ate. And in doing so, perhaps we will realize something that we have forgotten in the back of the modern refrigerator or on the digital delivery menus. That food, in its most essential form, is affection, is survival, is ancestry, and that no matter how poor it was, each meal told a story. Not of banquets, but of silent battles won with wooden spoons, and of hopes maintained with crumbs as hard as stone. Perhaps, at the end of this journey, you will feel a strange sense of gratitude, not for what you have in your pantry today, but for what still lives in the human imagination. Resilience, the ability to chew through scarcity and still find beauty in the simple, in the skin of an onion, in the acidic smell of a pickled product, in the sound of a boiling cauldron. These are forgotten sounds and flavors, but they still vibrate somewhere in the collective memory. And now that we have begun to hear them, let's allow them to echo a little more. Sometimes I think the sound of hunger has texture. It's not just the hollow sound of the stomach, but the creak of an old door's hinges opening to reveal a nearly empty pot. It's the sound of bare feet on cold clay, of voices falling silent when there's nothing left to say. It's a heavy silence, made of repetition, as if each day brought the same dish, the same taste, the same absence. But within that silence, a form of resistance also sprouted. Eating was, in a way, continuing to say yes to life, even when life seemed to have said no. And in this scenario, there were no choices. Meals were not based on desire, but on availability. If there were oats, you ate oats. If there were roots, you washed them with water and hope. If there was nothing, you drank hot water and tried to sleep. Still, there was beauty. Not the kind of beauty that shines, but the kind that persists. The care in sharing, the slow gesture of stirring the soup, the cloth that covered the bowl as if it were a treasure. Food was sacred because it was rare, and each crumb was a memory of those who came before, of those who perhaps were no longer there. I remember a story whispered by an old peasant. He said that hunger slowed down the world, as if time passed in drops, not minutes. In those moments, any smell became a promise. The distant aroma of bread coming from the manor house was almost a mirage. Children ran to see it, but came back empty-handed. And yet, they laughed. Childhood knew how to play with emptiness. They created mud feasts, pretended to chew leaves. Imagination fed them more than any pot. It was the body that ached, but the mind still flew. During the winter, the shortages became more severe. The dry branches looked like outstretched arms asking for help. The roots disappeared under the frozen ground. Animals, when there were any, were spared as much as possible. Eating was always a last resort. But there was something about that cold that also brought people together. People gathered around the fire, even though there was only one pot of thin broth. They told low-key stories, like someone whispering secrets to the wind. And there, between one spoonful and the next, something warmer than soup emerged, a warm well. Even on the darkest nights, there was a glimmer of light. A mother's gaze, a whispered prayer, a promise made at the foot of the bed. The peasants knew that hunger was not just a lack of food. It was also a lack of guarantees. But they also knew that everything would pass, that the harvest cycle would return, that the rain would bring leaves, that their hands would once again feel the weight of bread, no matter how hard it was. They did not have abundance, but they had patience. And with it, they sewed the days together, one by one, like someone embroidering a cloth of hope. In this introduction, I don't just want you to learn about the poor foods of the Middle Ages. I want you to taste them. I want you to notice the texture of the hardened porridge, the sound of the spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl, the earthy smell of freshly picked roots. Because these sensations tell more than any book. They remind us that history also lives on our skin, in our stomachs, in the silence between one bite and the next. And perhaps by reliving them, we can remember how simple things still sustain us. And now, if you're ready, let's get a little closer to the straw door, to the iron pot, to the brown bread left on the table. Take your time. The journey begins slowly, one spoonful at a time, one sound at a time. And if this story touched something inside you, well, there's plenty more where that came from. I'll be here every night, whispering stories that feed the mind and warm the spirit. The bread was dark and so hard that it sometimes had to be broken with a stone. The children learned early on to leave the piece in the broth, gradually softening it, as if teaching their own food patience. At first glance, it looked like a heavy block, almost odorless. But for the peasants, that piece of bread was more than food. It was survival molded by hand, a piece of clay that tasted like tired wheat, mixed with bran, oat husks, and even bone powder. When hunger became too frequent a visit, no one there ate white bread. That was the privilege of polished wooden tables, of halls lit with scented candles and full of laughter. In the villages, bread came from the leftovers of the mill, from the part that no one else wanted. It was made in a hurry, in ovens that barely held the heat, sometimes heated with wet twigs. The result was a dense, irregular bread, rough inside and out, the kind of food you don't choose, but accept, because it was still better than nothing, and because, in the end, there was something miraculous about being able to shape something like that and watch it harden in the sun as an act of faith. Its texture hurt the gums. It broke weak teeth, but it was eaten anyway, chewed with closed eyes and congestion. The elders said that bread taught one to be strong, that each bite required not only strength in the jaws, but also firmness in the soul. Sometimes the bread was so dry that the lips would crack. It had to be dipped in vinegar with garlic or in hot soup to bring it back to life. It was the bread of misery, but also of memory, because it sustained fragile bodies on long days, and it also made hearts remember what was possible to share, even when there was almost nothing. There was no yeast, only patience. The dough was left to rest, covered by a cloth that smelled of smoke. And even when the bread cracked while baking, even when its interior became too dark, it was kept as if it were something rare. And it was. Each piece represented hours of waiting, harvesting by hand, and grinding in old mills, powered by human effort or unpredictable wind. It was not bread that satisfied the desire. It was bread that sustained time, that helped to get through seasons of scarcity with a thread of dignity. It was hard as life, but faithful as an old companion. Around the table, the bread was placed in the center. Like a symbol, hands did not move forward in a hurry. There was an order, a respect, and also a silent gratitude. Each person broke off their piece as if it were a gesture of care, and even if it tasted weak, or there was mold on the edges, it was eaten with eyes turned downward, in a silence that seemed like prayer. Some kept it in their pockets, wrapped in cloth, to eat later. Others offered the last piece to whoever had the most hunched shoulders.
There was hunger, but there was also kindness. At that time, bread was not only food, it was also a spiritual symbol.
Mass spoke of the body, of sacrifice, of multiplication.
And the peasants, even without understanding all the mystery, looked at bread itself as something almost sacred. Perhaps because they knew how rare it was. Perhaps because, in the face of its absence, anything that filled the void took on the appearance of a miracle. And so, black bread became part of the soul of those people, not because of its abundance, but because of its persistence, because of the way it appeared, even if timidly, even if small, whenever life seemed to give way to a little respite. And today, when we talk about bread, we hardly think of this type. We think of the sweet smell, the softness that melts in the fingers. But the bread of old was different. It was a survivor. It was a scar. It was what was made with what was left. And yet, it fed.
And perhaps that is why it still teaches us that the essential is not always beautiful, but it is real.
That the beauty of overcoming hunger is not in the plentiful table, but in the act of sharing what is barely enough.
And that each slice torn off with effort can still carry the memory of those who resisted with crumbs and faith. The fire had been burning since dawn.
The wet wood took a long time to catch, releasing low smoke that invaded the thatch of the roof and made the eyes water.
But there, inside the cauldron darkened by time, what they called a meal began to form.
It was just water, and inside it, some leaves plucked from the field, perhaps nettles or some root that had survived the winter. Sometimes, to deceive the eyes and the spirit, a smooth stone was placed in the bottom of the pot. The stone was not for eating, of course, but its weight made the broth seem fuller,
and its heat kept it bubbling constantly,
as if silently saying that there was something there. The pot wasn't big, but there was room for everyone around it.
It was a circle of tired feet, hands warming themselves in the steam, eyes following each bubble as if some promise could emerge from them.
The soup was always thin, a trickle of pale liquid that barely covered the bottom of the bowl. But there was a ritual in its preparation. The herbs were picked carefully, washed with the same care one would wash a newborn baby. And when they were thrown into the hot water, they released an earthy aroma that invaded the room as if to say that the world was still alive. No one there expected flavor. Taste was a distant idea. What mattered was the heat. The soup warmed the inside, brought back rhythm to the heart, and eased the stiffness in the fingers.
On cold nights, it was also a blanket.
On cloudy days, it was a prayer. And even the youngest knew how to respect that moment. There was no rush. Each spoonful was a gesture full of memories, because they had already learned that time needed to be chewed slowly, along with the stalks, the tough fiber, the weak broth that became strong in the mouth of those who still wanted to live. In some villages, they said that the stone inside the pot was magical, that it brought strength,
that it was a family heirloom. Others saw it as just an illusion that was allowed,
a trick that deceived the senses, but also offered relief. After all, if the mind believed, the body followed. And so, generation after generation, the stone broth remained, not as a recipe, but as a symbol of that which is little but shared, of that which does not feed the body, but sustains the spirit, of the faith that is renewed every time the fire is lit, even without knowing if there will be anything else to put in the water. Children learned early on the difference between soup and hot water, and yet they were grateful.
They knew that the bubbling pot was a sign that the night would be a little less hard,
that there would be a reason to gather the family, even if in silence.
And it was in the silence that gestures could be heard.
The spoon touching the ceramic, the slow breathing after the first sip, the soft sound of wood crackling in the fire.
These sounds were also part of the food, because they fed something that the stomach cannot reach. They fed the sense of being alive, and of being together. There was something poetic in the way people looked at the soup.
Even though it was poor, it was celebrated. Every leaf that floated in it was treated with respect. Every drop was used. At the end, they scraped the bottom of the bowl with their fingers, and then with bread.
Not out of gluttony, but out of reverence, because they knew the work behind each ingredient, and because they also knew that this soup could be the last for a few days. Eating, in that context, was almost a spiritual act.
It was taking for oneself what the earth had offered, and returning to the earth the silent gratitude of those who had been welcome. And even now, if you close your eyes, you can perhaps smell the smoke, the warmth of the bowl in your hands, the simple, warm taste that doesn't need salt.
Because sometimes, what nourishes you is not what's on the plate, but what you feel around it.
And if this image touched you, get ready. There are many more memories stored in the humble pots of history.
And this is just the first spoonful.
Oats were what was left over when everything else had been taken away by time throughout all landowners. They were not a noble grain.
They did not make white bread,
nor were they suitable for large feasts. But there, in the forgotten corners of the mud huts, they were the ones who appeared when hunger was already stalking the bodies like a cold wind. They made cakes with them, not cakes as we know them today. No sugar, yeast or fillings, just raw oats, water, and a handful of ashes taken directly from the still warm oven. The ashes served to give volume, to thicken the dough, and in a way, to remind us that even what is burned can still be useful. These cakes came out dark, rough, with a smell that was a mix of smoke and wet earth. But even so, they were expected, because when the wood lit and the aroma began to escape through the cracks, hearts beat different. It was a sign that there would be something to chew, that the silence of the stomach would give way to the sound of hands molding the dough. The shape didn't matter much. Round, flat, crooked. Each one reflected the way it had been made, some in a hurry, some with hope, and all of them with the certainty that even the most bitter of flavors was still better than its absence. The ashes left a strange texture in the mouth, a slight bitterness that scratched the tongue. But they also brought back memories, because the taste was always accompanied by stories. Stories told around the fire while the cakes slowly browned on the hot stone. Stories of better times, of bountiful harvest, of grandparents who had also eaten that same mixture. Eating the oat cake with ash was, therefore, a way of remembering, of keeping alive an invisible line that connected generations through necessity, creativity, and the faith that everything passes. When the cake was ready, there was no ceremony. It was divided as one would divide something precious, but common. Hands would break the pieces carefully, not out of delicacy, but out of economy. Each crumb could be important, and whoever received the first piece always looked at it as if it were a gift. Even if the smell was strong, even if the texture resembled dust, it was cake after all, and cake carried, even in poverty, an idea of celebration. Perhaps that is why, even in the most difficult times, they still took the trouble to perform this ritual. Some families added herbs to the cake, others used dried leaves or even pieces of tree bark. Anything that could give volume, color, some illusion of abundance, not by mistake, but by instinct. The instinct to make something more out of little. And by chewing that food, people learned something profound, that the flavor might not be sweet, that the food might not comfort immediately, but that it still sustains. It sustains the body, sustains the memory, sustains the history of a people who, even with nothing, refused to stop. Some nights, when the wind shook the planks and made the fire waver, the smell of the cake spread like hope. The children slept with crumbs on their lips, the older ones smiled with half-closed eyes, and in that brief moment there was peace. The peace of knowing that another day had been overcome, that the oats, so simple, had once again fulfilled their role, and that the ash forgotten at the bottom of the oven had been transformed into food. A living metaphor that everything, even that which seems useless, can nourish in some way. Maybe you've never tasted anything like this, but if you close your eyes, you might feel it. The dry smell of burning wood, the heat of hot stone, the sound of dough being molded by calloused hands, and within all of this, the certainty that there is beauty in effort, that each piece, no matter how rough, is a gesture of silent love. And if this image sparked something in you, know that we still have many other forgotten recipes to rediscover together. The smell arrived before the food, a strong, salty odor that mingled with the coastal wind or the humid breeze from the rivers. Dried fish was, for many peasants, the only meat they had seen in months, and even then, it was not fresh meat. It was hard. It was hard-scaled, flesh darkened by time, by days hanging in the sun, all stored between planks next to the salt. There was something solemn about that food, maybe because of its rarity, maybe because of the silence that preceded it. When a whole fish was placed on the table, eyes lingered on it. No one spoke, no one hurried. You had to respect the presence of something so unusual. Getting fish was not easy. You had to walk to the river, or barter with someone who lived near the sea. Sometimes a basket of herbs or a few spoonfuls of flour would yield a portion, other times not. And then you had to rely on luck, or on the generosity of some older fisherman who remembered the time when he too had an empty stomach. The fish, when it came, was divided like a relic. Its flesh was cut into thin strips, dried in the sun, then dipped in salt. And so, it kept for weeks, sometimes months. It became tough, hard as leather. But still, food. Salt was a luxury. It was not used as a seasoning. It was used as a shield, to preserve, to keep alive the possibility of eating later. Salted fish did not please the palate. Its taste was bitter, metallic, heavy. But it provided sustenance. It was chewed slowly, as if each fibber were a small battle won. Sometimes it was boiled to try to soften it. Other times, it was eaten raw, scraped with a knife or with teeth. The important thing was that it existed, that it filled,
That, even hard and far from what was imagined as pleasure, it represented a promise that it was possible to go on another day. In coastal villages, fish was a symbol of life, of work,
of waiting. It was common to see children with improvised rods trying to catch enough fish to take home to their families. Each catch was celebrated in silence.
a look, a wave, a hidden smile.
The fish was carried with care, wrapped in cloth, as if guarding a rare gift.
And at home, even before being prepared, it was admired, because even before feeding, it already warmed the heart.
It was a sign that the effort had been rewarded, and that night there would be more than just leaf soup. There was also fear.
Fear of spoiled fish, of meat that had outlived its usefulness.
Of the smell that betrays, not warns. Some people got sick, others could handle it. The line between medicine and poison was thin.
But they took risks, because refusing food was a luxury they couldn't afford.
Eating fish that was too salty or too old was better than not eating at all. And this decision, often made in silence, shaped their lives. It shaped their bodies.
It also shaped their souls. They learned to be grateful even for what hurt their tongues.
On certain nights, the fish was roasted over hot coals, and the smell filled the house. The neighbors could smell it, and there were those who approached with soft excuses, hoping for a piece. Sometimes they received it,
Sometimes they didn't.
but the gesture of looking said a lot. It said the importance of that moment,
Of that dish,
and of what it meant. It was more than meat.
it was a memory of water. It was a memory of struggle.
It was a sign that the world, even though harsh, still offered some abundance.
And if you now imagine this fish, also imagine the sound of the knife scraping the skin.
The crackle of the meat hardening in the fire, the shine of the salt under the dim light of the flame.
And understand that there, in the hardness of the food, there was tenderness, because everything that sustains the body, even the simplest, also sustains the spirit.
And that was the function of the dried fish.
Not to please, but to support. And so we continue, swimming alongside the history of those who learned to live with what the sea, the land and time left behind. The hands knew where to look. On the damp slopes, among moss-covered stones, in the less obvious corners of forgotten fields.
That was where the wild onions grew.
Small, thin, with an aggressive smell and misshapen shape. And along with them, bitter leaves, twisted roots, herbs that few recognized.
Foraging was an ancient art, a knowledge passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, from elder to curious boy. It wasn't just about harvesting. It was about talking to the earth, understanding its signal, knowing what nourishes and what makes you sick. Each plant harvested was a choice, a risk, a chance to move on. The soup began before the pot. It began with attentive eyes, with careful steps so as not to step on anything that could still grow. And when the ingredients arrived, they came with dirt on their stems, with hidden insects, with the smell of wet fields. They were washed in silence.
Cut with a dull blade, thrown into the hot water that had been bubbling since early morning.
The onion gave off its aroma, strong.
It made the eyes burn, but it also reminded us that something was being prepared. Something that, even if simple, carried the hope of a less harsh night. The bitter leaves were not chosen for their taste.
They were chosen for their presence. They were there.
They were resilient. They grew where others would not.
And this stubbornness of the plant was seen as a virtue,
Because it had to be that way to live in those conditions.
stubborn, persistent, able to stay upright even without constant sunlight, even without care. The leaves were chopped, thrown into water, softened by the heat. Sometimes they released a dark liquid, sometimes they left the broth thick, but they always left their mark. Bitter, unmistakable, real. The soup wasn't pretty. It was thick, cloudy,
With chunks floating irregularly.
but it was the soup that brought the family together, that made everyone sit together. Even though the floor was cold and the walls let the wind through. Around the bowl, a respectful silence formed. The spoon sank in slowly. The first sip was always too hot, but no one complained. It was better that way,
Burning your mouth a little was a reminder that there was fire.
that there was life.
And with each spoonful, the bitterness of the leaf mixed with the heat.
It became almost sweet, almost comfort.
The children learned to like it.
Not right away, but over time.
They understood that the soup was not just for satisfying hunger.
It was for strengthening,
There were those who said that wild onions were healing.
that they warmed the inside, that they cleansed the body.
And there were those who, even without believing in any of this, ate the soup with reverence, because they felt it. Because I knew that the broth sustained more than just the body.
It sustained tradition. It sustained the memory of a time when people ate what the land gave.
And were grateful for it. Some saved the toughest leaves for the next day.
They made teas. They made poultices. They used them as cures. The line between food and medicine was thin. And perhaps that was true wisdom. To use everything, to honor everything, and even when the taste was too strong, to swallow it with respect.
Because there was history there.
There was effort. There was a silent attempt to transform the little into something greater, into something that united, that warmed,
That taught us to chew the bitter with serenity.
And if you can now imagine this soup, imagine the face of the person preparing it, the attentive eyes, the hands stirring the broth, the smell that fills the small space, and the steam that rises like a prayer. The soup of wild onion and bitter leaves did not feed dreams, but it sustained realities, and sometimes that is all that is needed. A hot bowl,
A firm taste.
a moment of warmth in the middle of the night. Barley was modest. It grew on little. It survived the fields that the noble wheat had already abandoned. Its grains were small, hard, wrapped in a husk that resisted touch, water, and haste.
And perhaps for that reason, the porridge made with it required time, a lot of water.
A lot of fire, and a lot of patience. It was like cooking the day itself, long,
No shortcuts, no promises.
just waiting for the heat to soften what seemed impossible to break at some point. And so, the pot remained there, hours.
Bubbling slowly, like an old man telling long stories with pauses in the middle of each sentence.
When the spoon finally managed to move inside the pot, that dense, almost pasty texture emerged, clinging to the metal and reluctant to fall. The porridge didn't run.
It lingered.
Strong, heavy. It was the kind of food that filled you up, that lingered in your body. And that was exactly what you were looking for.
Something that would stay.
That would hold your stomach.
That would help you get through the cold hours without hunger returning too soon.
It wasn't about flavor. It was about duration. Barley porridge was, above all,
A silent agreement between the body and time.
it was served in deep bowls, sometimes with a handmade spoon, made of wood darkened by use.
The same spoon was passed down through generations,
It was washed with care. It was kept as a sacred object.
because with it, many mouths had been fed, many nights had been comforted.
The porridge was food for mourning, for recovery.
For silence,
It was what was offered to those who had lost someone, or to those who returned from the field wounded.
it was as dense as the emotions that were not spoken, and as warm as the heart that was often missing.
In terms of flavor, almost nothing.
An earthy base,
A slight bitterness.
an absence of seasoning that made the palate seek meaning in the texture. But still, there were those who found sweetness,
Not the kind of sugar, but the kind of gesture. The slow preparation.
the gaze that follows the pan for hours.
The care hidden in each stir, in each bubble that breaks on the surface. The porridge was, in a way, a mirror. It showed the rhythm of whoever made it.
If it was calm, it came out light.
If there was anguish, it would clump. If there was pain, it would burn deep down. And even so, it was eaten.
Because that was all you had.
The children learned to wait. They knew that porridge was not a rush, that it was not like bread baked in a hurry or soup made from leaves picked at the last minute.
Barley took hours.
And that taught them something precious. The value of time, the beauty of seeing something transform little by little.
Of feeling the smell change.
The color darken, the spoon get heavier.
It was a learning experience that went beyond the kitchen.
It was a preparation of the soul, for life, for delays, for losses, for silences that were too long.
When it was finally ready, the porridge was eaten slowly, sometimes in total silence, other times with whispered stories between spoonfuls, stories of other winters,
Of other harvests, of other porridges that helped get through moonless nights.
and there was always a gesture of care when serving, a hand that adjusts the rim of the bowl,
A cloth that covers the bottom so it doesn't burn. A look that follows the person who is about to eat. As if to say, without words, here is everything I could offer. And that, in itself, was food. And if you allow yourself to imagine this scene, you might feel the heat rising from the bowl, the steam that tangles your hair.
the weight of the spoon between your fingers, and the simple taste of something that was made over time,
With intention, with faith that tomorrow would come.
The barley porridge was not a feast.
But it was sustenance.
It was resilience in the form of food,
It was memory in the form of texture. And for that, it is still remembered today.
because there is something eternal in things that take time to happen.
There was a specific sound that told you when the earth was starting to give way. It was the soft crackle of embers touching the skin of a turnip, the hiss of moisture escaping from inside a wild carrot,
And the almost timid crackling of roots finally finding warmth after cold and damp days.
No pots were used for this, just embers, ashes, and patience. The roots were thrown directly into the low fire, covered with a little coal, and left there until the smell began to spread.
A sweet, burnt smell, harsh and comforting at the same time, like everything in that life.
Food came from the earth, yes, but not from organized fields.
It was dug by hand, between rocks, between bushes, where tools could not reach.
Crooked turnips, tough radishes, carrots that did not bend to modern taste. None of it looked pretty, but it was food. It was possible to chew. It was possible to swallow.
And on days without soup, without bread, without porridge, a root was enough to remind the body that there was still something inside.
That it was still possible to walk. That it was still possible to sleep with less pain. Children used to play at looking for roots. It was a form of mission, of pride. To return home with something in one's small hands was to be a hero for a day. And when the bonfire was built, everyone would gather around, not to talk, but to watch. The fire was hypnotic. The embers danced. The flames caressed the wood. And in the center of it all, the roots were darkening, from the outside in, transforming. The smell of the earth was replaced by the smell of food. And that, in itself, was enough to nourish the soul. No seasoning was used. The flavor came from time, from coal, from effort. And when the root was removed from the fire, sometimes still steaming, the care was taken of someone handling a gift.
You clean the skin with your fingers, sometimes with a cloth, sometimes with the ashes themselves.
The inside came out warm, fibrous, slightly sweet. You had to chew it slowly.
Feel it.
Be thankful. Even if there was no abundance, there was presence. And that presence was more than enough. It was common to eat with your hands, not for lack of cutlery, but out of habit.
The heat warmed your fingers, passed through your wrists, and went up your arms. There was something ancestral in this gesture.
As if the body's memory recognized that food, that way of eating, that way of sharing.
A piece for each person.
No fighting, no rush, just the sound of bites, the soft noise of the fire, and the wind passing through the cracks in the cabin. Dinner happened there, on the floor,
around the embers.
No table,
no glasses,
but with meaning. Sometimes, at the end of a meal, someone would find a root that was still too firm. It was put back in the fire. More was expected. No one complained. It was part of the process. It was a time to pause,
to contemplate,
to feel the heat on one's feet, to hear the crackling mix with one's own thoughts.
Eating was not just a physical act.
It was a ritual.
It was shared time.
It was a way of remembering that the earth still offered, that the fire still transformed, that the body still responded. And if you can now imagine that moment, imagine the burning embers in front of you, the heat rising, the smell of the cooked earth filling the air, the texture of the root between your fingers,
and the simple but sufficient flavor. Because sometimes what is enough is not what fills.
It is what remains.
And there, between ashes and roots, there was permanent.
There was life. There was the warm silence of survival.
The forest held secrets.
And among them were mushrooms. Small, fragile, silent. They grew in the shade, among fallen leaves, on damp tree trunks, or on moss-covered ground. Not everyone knew how to identify them.
It was a knowledge reserved for the most attentive, the oldest, those who had learned by observing with their eyes and their bodies. One mistake could cost them dearly.
There were fungi that cured and others that killed. Sometimes the difference was a shade of color, a stain, an almost imperceptible smell. It took more than sight. It took intuition. Children were taught early
to look, to touch, to smell,
to listen to the stories,
because each type of mushroom came with a tale.
Some grew after a light rain, others only during specific moons. Some could not be picked before dusk. Others were only useful if dried in the sun.
It was a knowledge shrouded in mystery, almost magical, but also deeply practical. Because when there was no meat, no fish, no grains, the mushroom appeared as an alternative, as a gift that could save or deceive. Fear was also a part of it.
No one ate mushrooms alone, always in groups, always with caution. The first bites were small. People waited. They watched. Their bodies gave them signal. Their skin, their stomachs, their eyes. Eating mushrooms was like talking to the forest. It was like asking if you could stay, if that food wanted to inhabit your body or not. And when the answer was yes, there was relief. There was a kind of renewed confidence.
As if nature had reached out a hand.
Many mushrooms had a neutral taste. Others were bitter. Some left the mouth dry.
Others seemed sweet, but left pain afterward. It was a food that required courage,
and also humility, because it reminded us how much we depended on collective knowledge, on the advice of the elder, on the gaze of the woman who knew every corner of the forest.
Alone, no one took risks.
Together, they shared the risk and the food.
They shared not only the pieces, but also the responsibilities.
There were nights when the mushroom was cooked with roots. Other nights, it was fried in carefully stored fat. And even if the dish was small, the gesture of sharing made everything bigger,
because it wasn't just about satisfying hunger.
It was about celebrating the life that went on,
of giving thanks for the fruit of the forest,
for the knowledge passed on in silence,
for the luck of having picked the right one.
Eating mushrooms was like walking on the edge of a cliff, with balance, with respect, with an attentive heart. The rain was awaited, not as a threat, but as a promise, because after it, the tastiest mushrooms would sprout, the rarest ones. It was as if the water awakened from sleep what was hidden beneath the earth, and then trained eyes would follow the paths. Each step was taken with care. Each find was made with reverence. No one would pull in a hurry. No one would take more than necessary. The forest gave, but it also observed. And those who didn't understand this learned the hard way. And if you want to feel this scene now, imagine the humid forest, the sound of the drops still falling from the leaves, the earthy aroma in the air, the fingers digging slowly, the timid discovery of a small white stem hidden among the shadows, and with it, doubt, fear, hope. Because in difficult times, even the smallest mushroom could be the difference between another day or the end of a cycle. Eating sometimes was a leap in the dark. But it was also trust in the ancient wisdom that still whispered through the branches. In clay pots hidden in the coolest parts of the house, the forgotten vegetables lay. They were neither fresh nor pretty. Their skin was wrinkled, their color darkened, and their smell strong. But they were stored with care, because inside those pots a silent miracle was happening. Brine, water, salt, and time. That was all. And yet, it transformed everything. It transformed what would rot into something that would endure. It was as if time, when well managed, had the power to preserve, to protect, to keep alive the memory of what was once harvested. Making brine was an art. There were no exact measurement. Each family had its own way. Some added leaves to the vegetables. Others added pieces of garlic, mustard seeds, and dried herbs. The jar was sealed with cloth and stone. And then, silence. No one opened it before the time. They had to wait. The liquid fermented. The smell changed. The flavor built slowly, layer by layer, like someone patiently embroidering a story. No one ate brine the next day, or the next week, sometimes months. It was the food of patience. The vegetables inside lost their original shape. They became softer, more intense. The taste was acidic, penetrating. It was frightening at first, but then it became familiar. It was the taste of waiting, of transformation, and also of resistance. Because that food, even if deformed, still fed. It still made sense. It still sustained. And there was something wise in that. In accepting what had changed. In welcoming what had fermented. In not rejecting what was no longer fresh, but still full of meaning. There were days when the jar was opened with solemnity. A cloth on the table. A firm hand removing the lid. The first smell was strong. It filled the space, invaded the clothes, lingered on the fingers. But along with it came the memory of other times. The time when that vegetable was harvested. The time spent waiting. The time spent surviving. The brine was not just food. It was a liquid calendar. A marker of the season. A reminder that life happens even when you don't see it. Not everyone liked it. It took getting used to. Some said that only the elderly enjoyed that flavor. Maybe because they understood the art of waiting better. Maybe because they had already fermented it themselves, in their pain, in their memories. Eating vegetables in brine was an act of humility, of acceptance, and also of celebration, because it was saying yes to what had survived, to what had been forgotten at the bottom of a basket and yet still offered itself, to what had withstood time without rotting completely. The children learned to like it over time. They started with the less acidic parts. They learned to chew slowly, to respect what was different, and little by little, the taste stopped being scary. It became a sign that there was still something to eat, that the house was prepared, that someone thought about the future. The brine was a promise that, even in hard times, there would still be something safe, something possible, something that had survived through time to reach their mouths. And now, if you want to feel this experience, imagine opening an old jar, feeling the acidic vapor, seeing the soft pieces revealing themselves beneath the cloudy liquid, lifting one to your mouth with hesitation, and then realizing that that taste, so strange at first, also warms you, also welcomes you, because sometimes what nourishes us the most is what has already passed through time. And yet it remains, silently present. Garlic was more than a seasoning. It was a shield. It was medicine. It was protection against the invisible. In times when no one understood the names of diseases, it was called a purifier. It was chewed raw, mixed with vinegar, placed on doors, hung in windows. Its strong smell drove away more than appetite. It drove away fear, because there was something sacred about the plant with its penetrating flavor, something that the peasants could not explain, but felt. And that is why garlic was in almost everything. In bread, in soup, in the body. In many homes, vinegar was made from leftovers, old wine, fermented fruit, grapes that were no longer fit for the table.
It was an acidic, strong, burning liquid, but when it found garlic, it created a potion of strength.
They called it a tonic,
A medicine, a cure, a spoonful a day, a sip before going out in the cold.
a cloth soaked in it and placed over the chest. There was no scientific explanation, but there was conviction, and in times of fragility, conviction was all one had. Some said that vinegar killed demons.
Others said that garlic warded of evil spirits.
It was unclear where faith ended and healing began,
And perhaps that distinction didn't even matter.
because the body warmed up, the fever went down, breathing eased. That was enough. Eating raw garlic took courage. It stuck,
It made one's eyes water.
but it was necessary,
It was a silent ritual, a pact with possible health.
and each bite, each difficult swallow, was an act of resistance.
There was no perfume that could hide the breath.
But no one cared, because the smell of garlic was the smell of survival. It was on the clothes, on the hands, in the air of the house.
And also in the breath of words.
An old man could be recognized by the trail of vinegar he left, a mother by the warmth of garlic in the breath of the night. It wasn't about pleasing. It was about staying,
About continuing to breathe.
about getting through the seasons with something more than hope.
Vinegar was also used to clean wounds, to wash utensils,
To purify water, it was a liquid with multiple functions.
with 1,000 uses.
And for this reason, it was carefully stored, in darkened bottles, in hidden jars, and even when the stock was small, it was shared.
Because it was known that, in times of pain, a spoonful of vinegar could be worth more than a coin.
It was a sign of care, of presence.
Of wisdom transmitted.
Children would frown when they tasted it,
But they were taught to drink it anyway.
they grew up associating bitterness with strength, and they learned to respect that which was not sweet, but was vital. Garlic and vinegar taught that not everything that is hard should be avoided, that there is heat in that which burns, that there is protection in that which repels. It was a silent lesson, passed down from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, without ever losing its strength.
And now, if you take a deep breath, perhaps you can imagine the thick aroma of chopped garlic, the acidic vapor of vinegar rising from the spoon.
Your throat tightening as you swallow, and then your body slowly warming up.
Because there was something deeply human in that simple ritual.
The will to continue,
To live, to protect those you love with what you have, even if it's just a clove of garlic.
even if it's just a stinging sip.
Sometimes courage is measured that way.
The water began to boil slowly. Inside the iron kettle, old and marked by time, small bubbles rose like sighs.
Beside it, on the worn wooden table, rested dried leaves, tiny flowers, barks that had been collected throughout the week.
Herbs with sweet names and ancient functions,
Mint, chamomile, valerian, elderberry.
each one with its time, its secret, its type of silence.
Mixed together, they created a warm potion that went down the throat like an invisible caress.
It wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. Tea was made at night, when the tired body asked for rest, when the sounds of the village had diminished.
When the day's tasks gave way to rest,
It was then that the kettle was placed on the embers. The steam rose, bringing aromas that embraced the space.
and little by little,
People approached, first the older ones,
then the little ones, covered with blanket.
and then everyone sat around the fire, with the mug in their hands, with their eyes half closed.
With a lighter heart,
Each sip was a sigh. The heat of the tea slowly entered, warming the chest, dissolving the tensions of the day.
sometimes someone would tell a story, an ancient legend, passed down through words and silences. Other times, no one said anything. The fire spoke,
The kettle hissed.
and the world seemed to fit into that small moment, that instant when everyone was together,
Breathing the same aroma.
sharing the same calm. The tea was then more than a liquid.
It was a bond.
Herbs had effects.
Some brought sleep, others cleansed the body from the inside,
Some opened the breathing,
others calmed the restless mind.
and there were those who said that certain combinations opened the door to dreams, that they led to forgotten places, that they awakened hidden memories. No one knew how true this was.
But no one cared, because what mattered was the effect that came afterwards. The lightness, the pause.
The peaceful sleep that arrived like an invisible blanket. In some homes, teas were prepared with prayers,
Each leaf placed in the water came with a request,
a memory,
a thank you. It was a way of talking to time.
with those who had already passed away, with those who were yet to come.
And when drinking, everyone felt that something was changing, not only in the body, but in the spirit.
Tea brought people together. It connected the now to the past, the inside to the outside. It was a bridge and a place of rest. Children learned early on to respect tea time. They knew that there was no shouting there,
That there was no running there.
that it was time to listen.
The sound of the fire,
Grandma's voice,
the silence of others, and they grew up associating that warm taste with the idea of care, of comfort, of security,
because they knew that, as long as there was tea, there was home, there was ground, there was someone watching over them.
and if you close your eyes now, you might feel the warmth of the mug in your hands,
The light aroma rising with the steam,
the sound of the logs crackling nearby, and the murmur of an old story being told without haste.
because deep down, that's what teas do.
They slow down time. They transform waiting into companionship.
And they remind us that, even on the longest nights, there is still warmth to share.
Cabbage was not a luxury. It was persistence.
It grew even when the soil was no longer offering much.
Even when there was a lack of water. Even when the cold had already defeated other crops.
And so it became a constant present.
There was no pot for every day, nor enough firewood to cook everything.
So cabbage was eaten raw, in thin slices, torn off with a dull knife, served straight from the field to the table with a dash of vinegar, perhaps a pinch of salt when there was any. But even without anything, it fulfilled its role.
It filled the plate. It filled the silence. It was crunchy. It was noisy. And that sound, when bitten, seemed to fill the empty space between the voices.
It was as if each leaf snapping between the teeth told them that there was still something.
There was still something to chew. There was still something to hope for. Even though it was cold, even though it was hard to digest, the cabbage was accepted.
Because it was firm. It was resilient. It was like the peasants themselves.
It endured.
It persisted. It grew back.
And perhaps because of that,
It was viewed with respect. The elders swore that cabbage was a cure, that it cleansed the blood, that it protected the stomach.
that it expelled evil.
They made poultices with the leaves.
They applied them to wounds.
They used them against fevers. And they said that the stronger the smell, the greater the power. The children would frown.
But over time, they learned to recognize that aroma as a sign of care, of trying,
Of someone doing the best they could with what they had.
Cabbage was food, but it was also hope. There were houses where whole heads of cabbage were stored in cool cellars, wrapped in damp cloths, protected like treasures.
Because you knew that when everything else was gone, it would still be there, whole, raw,
Ready to serve. It was also used in preserves.
in brines, in concoctions that lasted through the winter. And with each preparation, a little bit of life was stored, a little bit of calm, a little bit of faith. When it was served at the table, no one expected flavor. They expected texture, something that would occupy the body.
That would make a sound. That would remind everyone that they could still chew.
They could still feel something real.
And in that real, there was solace. There was a kind of dry comfort. Hard, but true, because the cabbage didn't lie.
It didn't disguise itself.
It was what it was. And yet, it sustained.
The mothers cut the leaves with precision. They placed them on clay plates. They served with their hands, and they watched.
The sound of chewing was, for them, music.
A sign that their children were eating.
A sign that, even without luxury, there was a cycle underway.
The earth gave. The hand gathered.
The mouth received.
The body responded.
It was simple, and in that simplicity, there lived something profound.
And if you can now imagine, feel the coldness of the leaf when you touch it.
The dry sound when you bite it. The slightly sour smell that rises from the fibers.
And think of the power that exists in something so humble.
So common, so forgotten.
Because sometimes, what heals us the most does not come covered in honey or perfume. It comes from the earth. It comes raw. It comes straight. And it finds us exactly where we are. Wheat was a luxury that sometimes escaped from the noble's fields and reached the peasants' calloused hands.
But not always in the form of fresh flour.
Often, what was left were broken grains, wet from the rain, forgotten in poorly sealed bags. And it was precisely this wheat, fermented at random, that gave rise to an unexpected food.
A thick porridge with an acidic, almost aggressive smell.
A food that was not planned, but discovered.
And yet, welcomed. The fermentation took place slowly, in the corners of the pantry, in clay pots, under damp cloths. It was necessary to observe, to smell, to taste carefully, to know when the taste had crossed the line of what was bearable.
To know when it was still edible.
This porridge was neither sweet nor salty,
It was a strange in-between.
but it was filling. It was warm.
It warmed many bodies during long winters. It warmed hopeless nights.
And for that, it was respected. The texture was dense, almost sticky. It dripped hesitantly from the spoon, and when it reached the mouth, it required patience, chewing slowly, accepting the strange taste.
Feeling the heat flowing inside.
There was no accompaniment.
It was just her.
The porridge, the plate, the silence.
And the wind that sometimes knocked on the window as a reminder that the world continued outside.
But inside, everything was suspended.
As if time was also fermenting.
Some said that the porridge brought strange dreams, that it messed with the head,
that it awakened hidden memory.
maybe it was the effect of fermentation.
Or maybe it was the very state of mind of the person who ate it.
Because whoever ate this porridge was always on the edge,
Of hunger,
of waiting, of doubt. It was food for limits, for crossing,
and each spoonful was a step forward.
a step within oneself. The women stirred the porridge with a wooden spoon, unhurriedly,
As if each turn of the pot conveyed a thought.
a wish, a prayer, and as they stirred, they told stories about the wind, about the fields.
About the times when the wheat was plentiful.
The children listened with their eyes fixed on the pot, the steam rising, the spoon turning, the porridge thickening, and everything there seemed magical, even though it was so simple.
Fermentation was also a symbol that what spoils can become food, that what turns sour can nourish.
It was a living metaphor,
Of transformation, of adaptation.
of acceptance,
Eating fermented porridge was like embracing what was not planned.
and yet drawing strength from it.
There was something philosophical about that unattractive dish.
A silent lesson about the value of what persists. And if you imagine this scene now, perhaps you will hear the wind outside,
Perhaps you will smell the acidic smell rising from the bowl.
the heavy spoon, the strange taste, but inside, a strange feeling of completeness.
Because there are foods that do not please, but heal. That do not enchant, but sustain.
And between one spoonful and the next, they whisper ancient truths that time still carries in the air. Rain was a sign of opportunity.
When the drops fell gently on the fields and puddles formed between the rocks, you knew that snails would soon appear. Slowly, they emerged from their hiding places, leaving silvery trails on the dark earth.
And along the banks of the streams, frogs appeared with alert eyes and ready legs.
To many, they were just ordinary creatures.
But to those who had an empty stomach for days, they were food. They were living protein.
They were sustenance crawling before their eyes. The capture required silent attention. The hands knew how to catch, with lightness and precision.
There was no disgust. There was need. The snails were gathered in baskets lined with leaves.
The frogs were held firmly, but without violence. They were small creatures, but they represented a lot. A handful of them could feed an entire family for a night.
And so, each capture was a small triumph.
A gesture of victory in the face of scarcity.
The preparation was simple.
The snails were washed many times. Sometimes they were left to soak for hours, with herbs, vinegar, ashes. They had to be purified, cleaned of anything that came from the earth. The frogs were carefully opened.
No waste. Every part was used. The legs, especially, were roasted over the coals. The smell was light, almost sweet, and when the meat crunched between the teeth, there was a kind of pleasure hidden there.
Not the pleasure of the banquet, but of being alive.
Once again, eating snails and frogs was not a matter of pride.
It was a secret shared only among those who knew how.
It was not spoken about with outsiders. It was not offered to visitors. It was food of desperation, of the margin, of cunning.
But also of intimacy with the land, knowing where to find it, knowing how to prepare it,
Knowing how to eat it. It was knowledge that few had.
and it saved lives. At night, around the fire, the frog bones would crack between their teeth.
The sound was dry, small, but present. The children learned to chew slowly.
Enjoying everything.
Nothing was thrown away. The snail shells were saved, sometimes for use, sometimes out of respect, because even what served as a home for food deserved consideration.
Eating was always a gesture of bonding, of exchange, of reverence.
There were those who said that
Eating frogs gave strength to the legs,
that they brought courage,
that they prepared the body for long journeys.
and there were those who believed it.
Because sometimes believing was the only possible seasoning.
And in that thick broth made with scraps, with skin, with small meat, there was a density that warmed the inside, that sustained more than one could imagine.
And that left afterwards a satisfied silence hanging in the air.
If you close your eyes now, you might see the shine of the frog's moist skin in the moonlight. You might hear the sound of snails being washed in a wooden basin, and you might feel the firm texture of meat roasted over the heat of the embers.
Because, as unusual as it may seem, there was beauty in this food.
Not an easy beauty,
But a real beauty,
the kind that comes
from the instinct to continue, from the knowledge shaped by hunger, and from the deep bond between the harvester and the consumer. Honey was rare.
a sweetness in a state of miracle.
It appeared little by little, almost always by chance, when someone found a hive hidden among hollow branches or inside an old wall.
It took courage to collect it. The bees defended their treasure with ardor, but there were those who knew the right moment, the right gesture, the soft smoke that calmed the insect. And when the honey was removed, still dripping thickly, golden like the sun, everyone knew that that day would have a different flavor.
The children were the first to notice.
The smell was enough to make them run towards the house. Their eyes would shine when they saw the full bowl, even though there were only a few spoonfuls.
The honey was not kept.
It was celebrated.
It was shared in silence.
A finger dipped in, a thread on the dark bread, a drop in the hot water.
Small gestures that transformed everyday life into something magical.
There was no exaggeration. There was reverence.
And each sip was accompanied by a long sigh, as if expressing gratitude.
Honey was not mixed with everything. It was reserved. It was not diluted without purpose. There were days when someone would fall ill.
That was when honey would appear, mixed with herbs,
with roots, with vinegar. It was healing, comfort, warmth. It was also a promise
that sweetness still existed. That, even among so much bitterness, something gentle could touch the tongue and run down the body like an old song.
Whoever tasted it would not forget.
Because there was memory in the sweetness, a memory that soothed.
The wild honey was not like the store-bought kind.
It had different textures,
sometimes crystal, sometimes lumps, and the flavor varied depending on the flowers the bees visited.
There was dark honey, almost earthy.
There was light honey, light as a breeze.
And each honey told the story of a field, a season, an unseen harvest. It was as if nature was speaking through that nectar, and everyone listened, with attention,
with gratitude. The adults ate little.
They left more for the little ones, but one lick of the pot was enough for their eyes to slowly close,
for their faces to soften, for time to slow down.
It was a moment away from hunger,
a moment away from the harsh routine, as if the honey opened a window,
and through that window, a piece of the world entered that could still be good,
that could still be sweet, that could still be simple. Some people kept their honey for a long time, in clay pots covered with thick cloth. Others ate it all on the same day.
There were no rules,
just the feeling that this gift should be respected.
And there were also stories
of bees that guided last peasant, of hives that appeared in times of drought as a sign of hope.
Honey, then, was not just food.
It was an omen. It was a symbol. And if you want to feel it now, close your eyes.
Imagine your finger dipping into the pot,
the dense texture slowly dripping, the touch of sweetness on dry lips,
the silence that follows after the first taste. Because there are times when the miracle doesn't come with fanfare. It comes in the form of honey,
a small gesture,
a flavor that caresses.
And in that moment, everything seems bearable, everything seems possible. On nights when the manor kitchens were filled with smoke, laughter, and roasting meat, the peasants could hear it from afar. The sound of abundance was different. It was louder, more constant.
And there was a smell in the air that seemed to travel across the fields.
A smell of fat, of spices, of freshly baked bread.
They could not join in the feast,
but they knew how to wait.
And it was the next morning, or late at night, that the real feast began.
When the doors opened and the leftovers were thrown to those who had nothing, there were those who waited in silence, those who pretended they were just passing by, those who approached with their eyes lowered but attentive. The remains came in baskets, in cloths, in dirty bowls, bones with traces of meat, pie crumbs, crushed pieces of bread, fruit peels,
burnt carcasses.
And for those who had waited days for something like this, it was like receiving a gift from the gods. There was competition, yes,
but there was also order, a kind of invisible code.
The oldest first,
the children accompanied,
the sick protected. Nothing was wasted.
The bones were gnawed to the last.
The broth made from leftovers fed me for 2 days. Even the fat that dripped from the meat was saved to cook roots. There was celebration in the eyes of those who received it, and at the same time, there was a kind of pain.
An awareness that this luxury was not theirs, that this taste came from the leftovers of another world, a world that I ate until I couldn't eat any more.
And then, I dropped crumbs like someone throwing crumbs at pigeons. Even so, the hands that picked up the leftovers did so with dignity.
With delicacy. They washed what could be washed.
They heated what could still be warm. They shared it among themselves.
Because there was understanding.
What came from above did not belong to just one person. And when they sat down to eat, they ate slowly.
As if savoring not just the taste, but the moment.
As if recognizing that that moment, however brief, was a break from the harshness of everyday life.
The children often tasted their first different flavors there.
A seasoning they didn't know. A type of meat they had only heard about.
And their eyes lit up.
Not just because of the food, but because of the experience.
Because they felt, even if for a second, what it was like to live without the urgency of hunger.
The parents watched in silence.
And they kept that moment as if it were a photograph.
They knew it wouldn't happen again anytime soon.
But it was enough for now.
The bones were saved, cooked until the last trace of flavor. The old bread was softened with water. The crusts were turned into a topping for porridge, and each piece was used as if it were the last.
Because deep down, it really could be.
Eating leftovers was a profound learning experience.
Of humility, of gratitude.
Of survival.
It was a way of telling the body, we are still here. There is still something to chew.
And if you can now imagine it, see the faces around an improvised table. Hear the sound of teeth scraping a small bone.
Smell the aroma of meat mixed with ash.
And realize how human this gesture is. Eating what is left. Eating what is left. And still finding flavor.
Because sometimes what nourishes is not the origin of the food, but the moment in which it arrives.
And at that moment, even the leftovers could seem like a banquet.
There were times when hunger was so deep that there was nothing left to be done. No roots, no grains, no remains.
And then one would look at the ground with different eyes.
The earth, until then a path and shelter, also became sustenance.
Not by choice, but by impulse.
By desperation, by an ancient belief that everything that comes from the ground has power.
And then one would mix the dust with water.
One would shape it with one's hands.
And one would eat.
Clay was preferred.
Softer. Cooler.
Some said it cleansed the body from the inside, that it calmed stomach acids.
Others said it brought vision.
That it allowed the spirit to escape for a moment.
The truth is that no one knew for sure.
But everyone knew someone who had eaten it. And they also knew that in certain dry regions it was common.
It was the last resort.
The most intimate.
The most silent.
No one was proud of it, but there was no shame in it either.
It was simply what there was.
It was shaped into little balls.
Some women roasted them lightly. Others mixed them with dried herbs, with ash, with bitter leaves. It was an attempt to transform the unacceptable into something possible. The taste was earthy. The smell was like rain.
The texture crunched between the teeth.
But then there was a kind of relief, not from actual hunger, but from the pain of being completely empty. The earth filled, if only for a moment.
There were also beliefs that the earth carried the strength of those who had already passed, that feeding on it was a way of connecting with ancestors,
that, in the extreme moment, it was not just food, but a ritual, the body receiving back the dust from which it came. And in this gesture there was something sacred.
A reunion.
A cycle completed. Eating earth was not giving up. It was memory.
It was blind faith.
It was survival on a level that few dare to imagine.
The children watched in silence.
Some tasted, others just looked.
They knew that this gesture was no joke.
That there was a deep pact with the world there.
That something had been broken there. And perhaps that is why, after eating, many people cried.
Not because of the pain, but because of their conscience.
Because they knew they had crossed a line. That they had hit rock bottom. But that even there, they were still alive.
The mouth would dry out. The teeth would get rough. The body would react. Sometimes well, sometimes not.
But none of that mattered at that moment.
What mattered was the act. The moment when one decides that it is worth continuing.
That there is still something to try. That even the earth, despised and forgotten, can be an invitation to life.
And in that gesture, so raw, so primitive, there was beauty.
A wounded beauty.
But real. And if you can feel it now, imagine your hand diving into the ground.
Choosing the cleanest piece.
Shaping it slowly. Taking it to your mouth carefully. And then, the deep silence that comes.
Because there are experiences that cannot be explained.
They only come through. Eating dirt was that.
A passage.
A prayer without words. A silent request to continue. Hunger didn't just live in the stomach.
It also settled in dreams. It came in through the window at night, lay down next to the thin bodies, and whispered images of plentiful tables, white bread, thick soups, fruits that ran through the fingers. The children learned to live with it as if they were living with a ghost. They knew there was no point in fighting it.
They had to listen. And then they began to dream. Sweet, immense, detailed dreams, so vivid that, when they woke up, they could almost taste them.
These dreams were not just an escape.
They were training.
They prepared the spirit for the next day, for another journey through empty fields and pots with little left.
The mind molded flavors that the body did not have. It invented textures.
It created imaginary recipes. And there, in the silence of the night, a kind of invisible kitchen was born. A kitchen made of memories, desire and hope.
Each dream fed a little more the resistance of those who no longer had any strength in their legs.
Mothers watched. They knew that their children dreamed about food. Sometimes they would ask in the morning, "What did you eat last night, my little one?"
And the answer would come with a sparkle in their eyes, with enthusiasm, with details.
It was an invisible but powerful banquet.
And the mother would smile, even with her chest tight.
Because she knew that as long as there was a dream, there was a future.
There was strength. There was a type of nourishment that did not come from the earth, but from the heart. Some said that dreaming about food was a sign that it would soon arrive, that it was the body asking for it, and the world listening.
Others said that it was just an illusion,
But no one denied the relief that dreams brought, even if they didn't last long, even if they disappeared at the first ray of sunlight. It was a rest, a break,
A place where hunger did rule.
where the body could remember what it was like to feel complete, even if only for a moment. The stories told before bed helped. They spoke of plentiful tables, of successful hunts, of times when food grew like weeds and everyone ate until they lay down under the trees. These were repeated tales, memorized, passed down from generation to generation.
And as they listened, the children would slowly close their eyes.
Not to escape, but to visit, to encounter the abundance that reality did not allow. Dreams became a refuge.
And also a tool.
Hunger, then, educated, not as a gentle teacher, but as a severe mistress.
It taught us to imagine, to hope.
To resist. It made the mind a fertile field where it was still possible to harvest.
And in this invisible field, many peasants survived, sustained by images, by dreamed perfume, by invented textures.
Because the spirit, unlike the body, knew how to find sustenance even in absence. And it made a secret art of it. If you want to experience this now, close your eyes.
Imagine a simple dish, a piece of soft bread, a little melting butter,
A hot, steaming soup.
See all of this in detail, with affection.
Feel the smell, the taste, the heat. Because perhaps for a few seconds, this dream can also feed you.
Just as it fed so many.
Just as it continues to feed those who, even with nothing, still carry a set table within themselves.
Throughout this night, we walked slowly along forgotten trails. We smelled the aroma of thin soups, heard the crackling of fire under burnt roofs, touched the roughness of bread hardened by time.
We visited silent tables, where silence was seasoning and patience ritual.
We saw how each food, even the simplest, contained stories. Stories of struggle, of waiting, of small miracle.
And now, perhaps, you can see that eating was never just a physical act. It was a gesture of connection. It was emotional survival.
Medieval peasants didn't just chew what they had.
They chewed time.
They chewed doubt, longing, faith.
Each spoonful was a pact with life, a silent agreement between the body that asked for it and the world that offered little. And yet, they continued. They gathered around nearly empty pots as if they were gathering to pray.
And there, in the sharing of almost nothing, a kind of abundance was born that we have forgotten today. The abundance of being together,
Of sharing.
of continuing.
Today, we have plenty.
Full shelves.
Extensive menus.
But perhaps what they lacked was precisely what they had in abundance. Respect for food, recognition of the miracle that each piece of bread is.
Gratitude that arises not from quantity, but from permanent.
Because they knew that there would not always be a tomorrow.
And so they ate as if they were giving thanks,
As if they were praying with their teeth.
as if they were transforming even the hardest of cakes into an offering.
If at any point during this walk, you smelled the wet earth, heard the water bubbling in the bottom of the pot, saw the wrinkled hands stirring a porridge, then you were there.
You were among them, sitting on the edge of the field, waiting for the sun, waiting for something to sustain the body and, above all, the soul.
Because deep down, the hunger that hurts the most is not the hunger in the stomach. It is the hunger for meaning.
For connection, for belonging. And that is why stories survive.
Because there is food in them. Food that never ends.
That never spoils.
That can be served in silence, night after night. Food that warms us from the inside.
That restores our memories. That teaches us to look at what we have with different eyes.
And perhaps, who knows, to be more grateful, to desire less, to share better.
They chewed silence and survival. And in this slow chewing, they created a way of existing that has lasted centuries.
It still echoes in our dreams.
It still whispers in our ears when we lie down hungry for calm, for truth, for stories that make sense.
They left us a legacy without books,
A knowledge without words. An ancestral flavor that still lives in every spoonful we put in our mouths with intention. And if this story warmed your spirit, if it found a corner inside you that still hungers for humanity, well, there are many more waiting for you. Every night, just sit back, take a deep breath,
and let me tell you,
because I'll be right here, whispering old stories whenever you need me.